A leader steps up to a microphone and says a tariff will make another country pay billions. To the crowd, it sounds like a foreign nation reaching into its own pocket and handing over cash. But the physical reality of the collection tells a different story. This legal document moves goods across a border. Every shipment has an importer of record, legally on the hook for the duty. That importer is almost always a domestic business, a local retailer or wholesaler writing a check to their own government. This is the statutory incidence, the legal requirement of who must physically pay at the moment the container clears the dock. The foreign factory does not pay it. A company on this side of the ocean does. But writing the check is not the same as bearing the cost. To find the economic incidence, who actually feels the loss, we have to track that dollar after the border is crossed. We can measure this by looking at the trade conflict of 2018 and the even larger shifts that followed through 2025. The data from these years allows us to test a specific thesis, that tariffs behave less like a foreign penalty and more like a nearly invisible domestic consumption tax. Understanding why means separating two questions that sound identical but are not: who writes the check and who carries the cost. Blur them together, and you will fall for the slogan every time. Before looking at the macro data, we have to look at the mechanics of the port itself. When this container lands, it triggers a financial obligation that must be settled before the goods can move a single inch inland. At this moment, the foreign factory that manufactured these goods has already been paid. They owe nothing to the destination country's customs authority. The goods are legally frozen. They are only released once the importer of record, the entity bringing them into the country, fulfills the duty. This importer might be a global retail giant or a small local business, but they are fundamentally located on the domestic side of the water. Global logistics dictates that the initial financial drain of a tariff happens entirely within the domestic banking system. A business that suddenly owes more money does not simply absorb it. It attempts what economists call pass-through. Imagine a $2,000 tariff applied to a single shipment. That cost is now a permanent part of the importer's overhead. The importer could eat that $2,000, but they watch their profit margin shrink toward zero. For many, this is a path to insolvency. Because retail margins are thin, total absorption is the exception. Instead, the cost travels. The importer raises prices for the wholesaler, who raises them for the retailer. Ultimately, that $2,000 is folded into the price on the shelf. This shift is accelerated by competition. Because every domestic competitor faces the same border tax on the same goods, the entire market tends to raise prices in unison. The tariff cost never vanished. It merely moved from the customs form to the standard cost of doing business, eventually reaching the register as a higher price for the shopper. Looking at 2025, the average U.S. import tariff rate climbed sharply from 2.5% to 13%. New York Fed researchers split the burden of this historic spike. Domestic buyers bore 94% of the cost, while foreign exporters absorbed only 6%. This means more than 9 out of every $10 was extracted from the domestic economy, not from the foreign sellers. Why wouldn't those foreign exporters simply slash their prices to stay competitive? The data shows that exporters only lower their prices when forced, and they are rarely forced very far. In late 2025, a 10% tariff was met with only a 1.5% drop in foreign export prices. Foreign factories covered a sliver of the tax to keep the business, and they let the domestic buyer cover the rest of the spread. When taxed, importers hunt for a different door. China supplied 25% of U.S. imports in 2017, but fell below 10% by 2025. Goods simply rerouted through intermediaries like Mexico and Vietnam, who picked up the lost market share. This rerouting is not a free bypass. It involves logistical complexity and legal maneuvering to rewire global trade. Economists call this friction. Reshuffling a global supply chain requires significant capital expenditure and creates costly new inefficiencies. Avoiding the tariff often just converts the tax into logistical friction. The result is the same: a higher baseline cost that sits with the domestic economy. This finally settles on the price of ordinary things: cars, laptops, and appliances packed with imported parts. The impact isn't always instant. Existing inventory and supply chain contracts act as a temporary buffer against the shock. While a tariff is applied immediately, consumer prices rise gradually as costs work through the system. researchers found that by the 7-month mark, pass-through into prices is almost dollar for dollar. The tax takes time to surface, but it arrives in full. A tariff acts as a delayed fuse price increase. It hides inside the supply chain before eventually surfacing at the register. The belief that a tariff makes a foreign country pay is rooted in mercantilism, a worldview from the 1700s that treats trade like a zero-sum scoreboard. Modern economics suggests the opposite. Trade is a mutual gain. When you tax that exchange, you don't cleanly punish the other side. You mostly penalize your own people for buying what they wanted. This creates dead weight loss. Both sides end up with less real income than before the tax was applied. And the damage is rarely one-sided. When the other country retaliates, they create a mirror image of the original loss. This retaliation often strikes people who had nothing to do with the original trade fight, like soybean farmers who suddenly find their biggest markets closed. The farmer pays for the trade fight through lower prices at the silo, just as the shopper pays for it through higher prices at the store. None of this makes every tariff a mistake. There are strategic arguments for protecting certain industries or using trade as leverage in a negotiation, but those goals do not change the arithmetic of who pays. Pretending the money comes from abroad only hides the price tag from the people actually footing the bill. A tariff may be a tool, and sometimes it may even be the right tool, but the data leads to a consistent result. It is not a check mailed from overseas. It is a tax paid at home.